The snow had been falling for 3 days when they came to take everything she had left. Briar heard them before she saw them. The creak of wagon wheels on the frozen track, the low murmur of men who had already decided something before they knocked. She was standing at the stove with her back to the door, stirring a pot of thin broth that was more water than anything else, and her daughter Win was asleep in the corner wrapped in the only blanket that didn't have holes in it. She didn't turn around when the knock came. She already knew. Aldous Potts had held her husband's debt for 11 months. He had been patient, he said, when he came in October. He had been more than patient, he said, when he came in November. Now it was the middle of January, and patience, apparently, had limits.
There were 2 men with him. She didn't know their names and
didn't ask. They stood just inside the door and let the cold in with them,
and neither one of them looked at her directly, which she understood to mean that they were not entirely comfortable with what they were doing, but were going to do it anyway.
Potts himself looked perfectly comfortable. He was a thick man, well fed in a way that most people in the valley weren't, with a coat that had real buttons and boots without a single crack in the leather. He held his hat in his hands and turned it slowly, which might have looked polite if his eyes weren't already moving around the room, taking inventory. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. "Don't," she said. "The note came due at the first of the year. I know when it came due." Win stirred in the corner. Briar didn't look at her. She kept her eyes on Potts and kept her hands wrapped around the wooden spoon because it was something to hold. "The property," Potts said, "and the livestock. That covers most of it. Not all of it, but most. And the rest?" He turned his hat again. "There's a man in Dunmore who takes on labor contracts. Domestic work, mainly. Cooking, cleaning. He places women with households that need—" "No, Briar, my name," she said, "is Mrs. Calloway." He stopped turning the hat. The 2 men near the door shifted their weight. "There's the child to consider," Potts said, and his voice had gone gentler, which was worse somehow than when it was businesslike. "A woman in your situation with a young one, no family nearby. This is actually a reasonable arrangement. You'd have a roof, food. The child would be provided for." Briar set the spoon down on the edge of the stove. She turned around and looked at him for a long time. "Get out of my house," she said. "I'll have your answer by Friday." He put his hat back on. "Friday," he said. "That's reasonable." He glanced at Win, still curled in the corner, and something moved across his face that might have been genuine feeling, or might have been the look of a man who had learned to wear genuine feeling when it was useful. "I am sorry for your loss," he said. Calloway was a decent man. Then he left, and his 2 men left behind him, and Briar stood at the stove until she heard the wagon move off down the track. Then she sat down on the floor, not because her legs gave out, though they might have. She sat down because the floor was the lowest place she could get to, and she needed to be low for a minute. She put her back against the cabinet and pulled her knees up and pressed both hands over her mouth, and she stayed like that, while the fire ticked in the stove and Win breathed slowly in the corner. 3 days. She had 3 days to find something that didn't exist. The money was gone. She'd sold the good horse in October, the tools in November. There was the milk cow, but Potts had already counted that. There was the land, but Potts had already counted that too. There was nothing left that she could think of that wasn't already spoken for. She was 26 years old, and she had a daughter who was 3, and she had 3 days. In the morning she went to see the only person she could think of. May Duchamp was 60-something, and lived at the edge of town in a house that was small but solid, and smelled permanently of dried herbs, and something sweet she burned in the evenings. She had been a midwife for 30 years, and knew more about what happened in the valley than the pastor and the sheriff combined. And she had delivered Win on a night in March, 3 years ago when the snow came sideways and Briar's husband had been 2 days out on the supply run. May opened the door before Briar knocked. "I saw you coming up the road," May said. "Come in." Put the child down. Wynne went to the rug near May's stove without being asked, which was the effect May had on small children and large dogs alike. Briar sat at the table and accepted the coffee that appeared in front of her and didn't say anything for a moment. "Potts came," she finally said. May sat across from her and folded her hands. "I heard. How this is a small valley, Briar." Briar wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "He wants me to sign a labor contract. There's a man in Dunmore who places women." May was quiet for a moment. And I don't want to go to Dunmore." She looked up. "I don't want to take Wynne to Dunmore and work in some house for some hands I've never met and spend the next 5 years paying off a debt that was never mine to begin with. The debt was your husband's. Owen is dead. The debt didn't follow him. It stayed here with me." She set the cup down. "Is there anyone at all, who needs a hand? Farm work, anything. I can work. I'm good at it." May was quiet for a long moment, which was not the same as not having an answer. "There's Stellan," she said. Briar waited. "He's up on the North Ridge. Has been for 8-9 years now, I think. Came down for supplies twice last winter, once the winter before. I don't know what he does up there exactly. Trapping, mostly. Some mining, I've heard." May looked at her coffee. "He has a place. A real place, not a shack. His father built it before he passed. There's land up there that isn't worked. You think he'd need help. I don't know what he needs. I'm not sure he'd tell you if he did." May looked at her directly. "He's not a bad man. I want to say that clearly. He's not a bad man. He's just a particular kind of man, quiet, keeps to himself. People in town think he's strange because he doesn't want what most people want. But in 30 years I've never heard a cruel word about him. We're on the North Ridge, 4 hours up the old logging road. There's a fork just past the 2 burned pines. You take the left branch. You'll see the chimney smoke before you see the house." Briar was quiet for a moment, looking at Wynne, who had found a small carved wooden horse somewhere near May's stove and was walking it slowly across the floor. "If he says no," Briar said. "Then you'll have tried," May said, "and we'll think of something else." She left Wynne with May and started up the North Ridge before noon. The logging road was worse than she'd expected, rutted from the last freeze. The ruts filled with ice that cracked under her boots and let her foot sink into mud underneath. The trees closed in an hour above town, Douglas fir, so thick the sky went to a narrow, grey strip between them, and the wind that had felt merely cold at the valley floor felt like something with intent up here, something that wanted her to turn around. She didn't turn around. She found the fork past the burned pines and took the left branch, and 40 minutes later she smelled smoke. Wood smoke. A good fire, not the desperate scraping kind she'd been keeping at home. Then she came through the trees and stopped. The house was bigger than she'd expected. Not large by any account, but solid, thick-logged, with a real roof and a covered porch and 2 windows with actual glass in them catching the grey winter light. There was a stable to one side, and she could see the shapes of horses inside. A woodpile ran the length of the far wall, stacked so neatly it looked almost deliberate, like someone who had strong feelings about organization had taken those feelings out on the firewood. There was a man on the porch. He was standing at the far end, with his back to her, working at something she couldn't make out, some piece of equipment, leather and metal, his hands moving with the slow, certain kind of focus that meant he had been doing this thing for years. He was large, not just tall but broad, the kind of build that came from actual use rather than show, and he wore no coat despite the temperature, just a heavy wool shirt with the sleeves pushed to his elbows. He didn't turn around. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "I'm looking for Stellan," she said. "Found him," he said. "Still working. Still not turning. My name is Briar Calloway. I live down in the valley. I had the Calloway homestead, the one on the East Fork. My husband Owen passed in September. I have a daughter. I have a debt I can't cover and a man named Potts who wants me to sign a labor contract and go to done working." He still didn't turn. May Duchamp said you might have work, she said. I can do anything that needs doing. I'm not particular about what it is. I'd need somewhere to stay, for myself and my daughter, and I'd work against whatever arrangement seemed fair to you. I'm not asking for charity. He turned around. His face was what she'd expected, and also not what she'd expected. Hard-planed, weathered, a dark beard that was more functional than styled, but his eyes were a clear, light grey, and he was watching her with an expression that was very still and not, she thought, unkind. He looked at her for what felt like a long time. How old's the daughter? He finally said. 3. She healthy? Yes. He looked out at the tree line for a moment, then back at her. I don't need help, he said. She had prepared herself for this, and she didn't flinch. I know. He waited. But I'm asking anyway, she said, because I don't have another option that doesn't involve leaving this valley, and I don't want to leave this valley. Owen is buried here. My daughter was born here. She stopped. She hadn't meant to say that much. I'm sorry, that's not your problem. He looked at her for another moment. The woodpile needs restacking on the south end, he said. Wind knocked it last week, and there's a door on the stable that's been dragging since November. She waited. You can use the back room, he said. It's not much, but it's warm. I'll clear my things out of it. I don't want to put you out of your own. I sleep near the fire in winter anyway, he said. He picked up the piece of equipment he'd been working on. She could see now it was a harness, and walked to the door. Go get your daughter. Road's only going to get worse after dark. She went back down the mountain and got Win and everything she could fit into 2 packs, and she was back at the house by late afternoon, and Stellan was in the stable when she arrived, and didn't come in to make the arrival into something it wasn't, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. The back room had a cot and a small window and a hook on the back of the door, and it smelled like cedar and old leather. Someone had put a candle on the small shelf near the cot. She didn't know if it was intentional. She unpacked their things and put Win down, and sat on the edge of the cot and listened to the fire in the other room and thought, one day at a time. She got up the next morning before Stellan and started the fire in the kitchen stove, and found where he kept the flour and made biscuits, because she needed to do something with her hands, and because she had nothing else to offer except work. When he came in from feeding the horses and saw the biscuits on the table, he stopped for a moment and then sat down without a word. He ate 4 of them. She counted without meaning to. The days built a shape around them. She cooked and kept the house and restacked the south woodpile, and found that the stable door had a cracked hinge that needed replacing, not just adjusting. She told him about it. He found the hinge in a box in the stable that she would not have known to look in, and she held the door steady while he replaced it, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold stable air. They didn't talk much. She had thought this would be strange. She had been married to a man who talked constantly, who filled every quiet with sound, and she had loved that about Owen, and also sometimes been exhausted by it. But Stellan's silence was different from absence. He was present in it. He noticed things. He noticed when Win favoured her left hand and left a small ball on the table that he had carved from a knot of pine, placed without comment the morning after he'd noticed. He noticed when the latch on the back room window was sticking, and fixed it before she asked. Win, who had been wary of strangers since Owen died, followed him to the stable one morning 2 weeks in, and stood in the doorway watching him brush the horses. He didn't speak to her directly for several minutes. Then he said, without turning, "You want to learn their names?" Win said yes. He went through all 4 horses with care, and Win repeated each name back in her 3-year-old pronunciation that was its own language. And, when he got to the last one, a grey mare he called Smoke, Win said Moke, and he made a sound that Briar, watching from the yard, realized was a laugh. She had not heard him laugh before. She turned away quickly, as if she'd seen something she wasn't supposed to. The trouble came in February. the way trouble in that valley always did. Out of the tree line, unannounced at a bad hour, she heard the horses first. It was past 10, Wynne long asleep, and Stellan was. She didn't know where Stellan was, somewhere outside. He often moved around the property at night, in a way she'd stopped questioning. She heard the horses come up the track, and then stop, and then voices, low and multiple, and something about the sound of them reached down and pulled at her stomach in a way she recognized and didn't like. She went to the window. 3 men. She didn't know them, but she understood what they were, the way you understand some things without having been told, the way they sat their horses too loosely, the way one of them had a bottle, the way none of them looked at the house directly. Men who had decided something in advance. She heard the door to the stable open. Stellan's voice, level and flat, and carrying in the cold air. "What do you need?" Not a question. The man with the bottle said something she couldn't make out. Then another one said a name, Potts. And she went cold. She had known somewhere she hadn't let herself fully think about that Potts wouldn't simply wait. The labor contract arrangement was profitable for him. A woman with skills and a small child, no family, no options. That was a commodity he'd had picked out, and she had simply removed herself without his agreement. She didn't think. She was moving before she'd decided to move, pulling her coat on, and then she stopped with her hand on the door. Wynne. She couldn't leave Wynne, and she couldn't bring Wynne into what was outside. She stood with her hand on the door and listened. Stellan said something, short and precise. The man with the bottle raised his voice. She heard the word contract, and the word debt, and the word belong. Then she heard a sound like movement, fast and purposeful, and then a sound she didn't want to think about clearly, and then silence. Then, "Get off my property." Stellan's voice, same flat register. Not loud. She heard horses, not approaching, leaving. She stood at the door for another moment, then opened it. He was standing in the middle of the yard. He had a cut above his left eyebrow that was bleeding into his eye, and his right hand was held slightly away from his side in a way that meant it had taken impact. He looked at her when she came out, and something shifted in his expression. Something that tightened and then deliberately didn't. "Go back inside," he said. "You're bleeding." "Come inside," she said. "Bria." "I have thread," she said, "and I've sutured a wound before." "Come inside." He came inside. He sat at the kitchen table and held still while she cleaned the cut, and she could feel how much effort the holding still cost him. Not from pain, she didn't think, but from something else. He was not accustomed to being tended to. That was clear. He sat the way a person sits when they've been self-sufficient for so long that receiving help has become almost incomprehensible. She put 4 stitches in and tied them off and cleaned the area again, and the whole time neither of them said anything, and the silence was different from their usual silence. It had weight. It had the particular weight of things that haven't been said. "He's going to come back," she said finally, cutting the thread, "or he'll send more men." "Probably me." Yes. She looked at him. He was looking at the table. The candle she'd lit made shadows move on the planes of his face. "I'm sorry," she said. "I should have. When I came here, I didn't think." "You thought what you needed to think," he said. "You needed somewhere to go, you went. That doesn't make it your problem." He looked up at her then. "You're on my property," he said. "That makes it my property's problem." "Which makes it mine." She sat down across from him. "I could go," she said. "I could take Wynne and go to my sister in Benton. She's not well off, but she'd take us in. It would solve your—" "No," he said. She stopped. He was looking at her directly now, those light grey eyes level and unambiguous. "You came up this mountain because you didn't want to leave the valley, because your husband's buried here and your daughter was born here." He paused. "Those are real reasons. They're not your reasons." "No," he agreed. "They're yours, but you don't leave them at the door when someone takes you in." He looked back at the table. "Potts is 3 people and a debt. I've dealt with worse." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why did you let me stay?" she said. "When I came here, you said you didn't need help." He was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. "You said you weren't asking for charity," he finally said, "and you meant it. I could tell." He picked up the empty cup she'd given him earlier, turned it in his hands. "A lot of people come up here asking for things. They dress it up different ways, but it's asking. You came and said, 'I have a problem and I have work in me and I need a place to do it.' That's different," she said, very quietly. "It doesn't feel different." "I know," he said, "but it is." The matter of pots resolved itself in a way she hadn't expected. May Duchamp, who knew more about what happened in the valley than anyone, apparently also knew things about Potts that Potts had preferred to remain unknowing, and she communicated those things, with precision, to the county land office in March, and the result was that Potts found himself occupying considerably more of his attention than he had available to spare on outstanding labor contracts. She heard this second-hand from May on a supply run in early March. She stood in May's kitchen with Wynne pulling at her sleeve and absorbed the information, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight since January. She didn't tell Stellan right away. She wasn't sure why. She carried it around for 2 days, and then one evening when Wynne was down and they were both at the table. "She's mending," he's sharpening a blade with the long, methodical strokes she'd grown accustomed to, she told him. He listened. He set the blade down. "Good," he said. She laughed. She hadn't expected to. It came out of her unexpectedly, and he looked up at the sound of it with an expression she didn't entirely know how to read. "Sorry," she said. "Don't be," he said, and something in his voice, when he said it was different from his ordinary "don't be," which was flat and meant functionally nothing. This one meant something, she felt it. Land. Spring came slowly to the North Ridge, later than the valley by 3 weeks. But when it came all at once. Crocuses through the snow crust, the sound of water moving again under the ice, the horses pressing their noses into the warming air. Wind-discovered mud with a scientific intensity that occupied most of her days and required a complete change of clothes, at least twice before dinner. Briar was in the yard one morning in April, hanging the washing when she realized she was happy. Not the relief of crisis averted, not the numb forward motion of getting through. Happy. Specifically, and currently happy, standing in mud-thaw April air with wet clothes in her hands and the sound of Wynne narrating to herself in the stable where Stellan was teaching her to brush smoke. She stood with a shirt in her hands and felt the happiness, and also felt how frightening it was, because it had a shape she recognized, and the last time it had had that shape she had lost it. She heard Stellan's voice inside the stable, low and patient, correcting something about the angle of the brush. Wynne's voice, explaining why her angle was actually better. A short silence. Then, unmistakably, a concession from him that the angle was perhaps not wrong. She put the shirt on the line. She had not planned to stay past spring. That had been not an agreement exactly, but an understanding. Crisis resolved, she would reassess. She would figure out what came next. What came next was harder to see now than it had seemed in January. She brought it up that evening because she thought she probably should, because not bringing it up felt like a different kind of dishonesty, she said, carefully, that she thought about the arrangement, that she knew it had been temporary, that she didn't want to assume. He was quiet for a long time. "Wynne calls the grey mare Moke," he said. She blinked. "Yes." "Ah, Smoke lets her." He turned his coffee cup. "Smoke doesn't let anyone near her, not even me most mornings." He was looking at the table, the way he did when he was saying a thing sideways. "I put a gate on the south pasture last week. It'd be useful in summer, for someone who wanted to put a kitchen garden in." She didn't say anything. "The back room has 2 cots in it now," he said. "There wasn't a second one before." He looked up. "I don't know if you noticed." "I noticed," she said. "The road down is good until November," he said. That gives you time to decide whatever you need to decide. He looked back at his coffee. I'm not asking anything. I just want you to know the gate's there. She looked at him across the table in the low firelight of a spring evening, this man she had come to in desperation and found something she hadn't expected, this quiet, steady, deliberately kind man who expressed feeling through harnesses and gate latches and a second cot, appearing in a room without announcement. Tell me about Smoke, she said. How you got her. He looked up, surprised. I want to know, she said. He told her. It took a while. He was not a man who told stories quickly, and this one had detail he seemed to feel mattered. The trader, the condition the mare had been in, the particular stubbornness of her recovery. The first morning she'd let him put a hand on her neck without flinching away. Outside the window, the snow on the north ridge was melting. Wynne, asleep in the back room with the small pine horse he'd carved her, tucked against her chin, breathed in and out in the particular slow rhythm of a child, who is completely and entirely safe. Briar listened to Stellan's voice, move through the story, unhurried, and felt the happiness again, less frightening this time. Something that had been holding its breath for a very long time let go.